Okay, so that was a lot of buildup. Here's the payoff. The untouchability argument is an instance of that argument form. Its first premise is this. It's an untouchable fact that the state of the world 2 million years ago was S, and that the laws of nature were L1 through Ln. And then we're going to spell out in just a second what all that means. The second premise is it's an untouchable fact that if the state of the world was S and the laws were L1 through Ln 2 million years ago, then Professor Barker eats waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/22/2022. Swap in yourself and something that you did recently that you think probably that was free. Put that in there instead of JB eats waffles. Conclusion of the argument, the untouchability argument, UA3, it's an untouchable fact that JB eats waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/22/2022, or whatever your action you've substituted in there. In other words, the conclusion of the argument is that no one can ever do anything to change the fact that I had waffles at 7 a.m. at 4/22/2022. All right, so the first premise says that it's an untouchable fact that the state of the world 2 million years ago was S and the laws of nature were L1 through Ln. Really, this premise doesn't require much defense. Instead, we just need to explain what these words mean, and once we do, it'll be pretty clear that no one should really deny this first premise. So S is just an abbreviation or a name for whatever the complete state of the world was. Some arbitrary moment in time 2 million years ago. I think in class maybe I did 10 million years ago. All that matters is that the arbitrary moment you're picking is a time long before there were human beings. Consider everything going on, the position of every particle, the behavior of every dinosaur, the growth of every tree, whatever going on at that moment. Put all of that in S, call that S, the state of the world. And the laws of nature L1 through Ln are just whatever the laws of nature were that were operative at that time, which are the same ones that are operative now. Again, these are just like abbreviations or names, placeholders, so that we don't have to spell out the details, which would not actually be physically possible. Visually, you can think about it this way. Everything inside the brackets, and of course a whole lot more, is S and L1 through Ln. Everything going on and the laws at that arbitrary moment 2 million years ago. Now, clearly, there's nothing anyone can do to change what's in S, right? Nothing I can do to change the fact that there was a particular beetle crawling along the toenail of a brontosaurus at a particular location in North America, say, at that arbitrary moment. I can't do anything about the fact that that's the way things were, nor could I ever have done anything, nor could anyone else. The same goes for every fact in S. There's also nothing that anyone could have ever done to change the laws of nature. I mean, that's true now, right? We can't change gravity. That's not something any of us has ever had control over. So put those two together and you get the obvious and uncontroversial premise that it's an untouchable fact that the state of the world was what it was 2 million years ago, and that the laws were what they were 2 million years ago. All of that together, no one could ever do anything about it. That's all that first premise says. Once you understand what it says, and some of the abstract language has been defined, it becomes clear that it doesn't really require much argument. The premise that does require a bit more motivation is the second premise, UA2, which says it's an untouchable fact that if the state of the world was S, and the laws were L1 through Ln 2 million years ago, then Professor Barker eats waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/22/2022, or you do whatever you're swapping in as your example of something that seemed like a free action of yours. So what's going on with this second premise? The second premise is saying not only is it an untouchable fact, as the first premise said, that things were what they were millions of years ago, but it's an untouchable fact that if they were that way, then I was going to be eating waffles on 4/22. Why think this? And of course, why think that you could substitute in any other action and you would get something true? Well, 3 steps really quickly. This is, again, not comprehensive. We went into more detail in class. The idea is this. Let's begin by assuming that determinism is true. Why are we doing this? Well, because this argument is an argument for incompatibilism. So although Van Inwagen is not a determinist, what he does is at the second premise of the argument, he assumes determinism's truth for the sake of proving that it follows that there's no free will. And then he backs up and says, hey, I've just proven that if determinism, then no free will. And that's just incompatibilism. So the defense of the second premise begins by assuming that determinism is true. Determinism just says, in general, the state of the world at any given time and the laws at that time guarantee a single unique state of the world at the next moment in time. In general, for every state of the world at any moment, you could possibly pick. The second step is to just consider a specific implication of the truth of determinism, or a specific instance of the truth of determinism. For example, if determinism is true, then the state of the world being S and the laws being what they were 2 million years ago guarantee a future in which I eat waffles, or a future in which you choose to go to Wake Forest, or whatever it is you did that seemed to be to you to be a free action. This is just a specific example of a link between the past state of the world and some future event that, given determinism, is a causally necessitating or guaranteeing link. The state of the world being what it was guarantees, if determinism's true, that I was going to eat waffles. So here's just visually what's going on. We could replay the state of the world over and over and over. If we plug in the same input, I am always, no matter what, going to eat waffles on 4/22/2022. The only way for me to have not eaten waffles on that day would have been for the state of the world back then to have been a little different, or for the laws to have been different. And then the third step is just, once we see that assuming determinism's truth leads us to this claim that the state of the world being what it was guarantees my eating waffles, now just add the very plausible claim that neither I nor anyone else can do anything to change determinism's truth. Nor can I or anyone else do anything to change the fact that if determinism's true, the state of the world being what it was guarantees that I'm going to eat waffles on that day. That if-then claim, if the state of the world was what it was 2 million years ago, then I eat waffles, that itself, the whole thing, is an untouchable fact. And that gets us UA2. And now when we put together UA1 and UA2, we get to the conclusion that, therefore, it's an untouchable fact that I eat waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/22/2022. This is the conclusion of Van Inwagen's untouchability argument. Of course, there's nothing special about my eating waffles. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Is this argument valid? Right? So when at the beginning of the semester we said to evaluate an argument, you ask, is it valid? Is it sound? Is it valid? Well, it's not modus ponens, so it's not just obviously valid, even though it looks a little bit like modus ponens. But if Van Inwagen's principle about the logic of untouchable facts is true, then this is a valid argument form. On the other hand, if principle's false, then this is an invalid argument form. And we already went over a little bit about why Van Inwagen thinks principle's true, and I mentioned that if you can come up with a counterexample to it, then you've got a deep objection to the untouchability argument for incompatibilism. So I leave it to you to consider whether you think principle's true, and so whether you think this argument's valid. The soundness, I think, is interestingly less controversial than the truth of the premise is a little less controversial than the validity. This argument, unlike most of the others we've studied, where the question is whether the premises are true and it was obvious that it was valid, this one, most people will grant the truth of the premises, but the question is whether that conclusion really does follow from the truth of those premises. And that just boils down to whether principle's true. So just two brief clarifications here. This is very abstract, so you might just be like, okay, what does this have to do with free will? We're talking about untouchable facts and states of the world. Remind me why this is relevant to free will. Here's another clarification question. Why is this an argument for incompatibilism as opposed to the conclusion that everything I do is untouchable or something like that? Okay, let's start. What does this have to do with free will? If we look at UA3, it says, therefore it's an untouchable fact that JB eats waffles at 7 a.m. on 4/22. Let's just remember what it means for a fact to be untouchable. That just means that it's a fact that no one has ever had the power to do anything to change. It follows, in other words, from 3, that I don't have the power to change the fact that I ate waffles that morning. In fact, it's not just that I, right now, looking back into the past from a week ago, can't change what happened a week ago. If it's an untouchable fact, then I never had the power to change the fact that I was going to eat waffles right at that moment or a second before. I felt as if I was radically free and I could either eat waffles or go without breakfast or have something healthy, but that was an illusion. I never, in fact, had the ability to do anything other than what I did. In other words, if Van Inwagen can convince you that UA3 is true, and specifically that it follows from the assumption of determinism, what he has shown is that we always violate the ability to do otherwise condition on freedom, which says that someone is free to do something only if when they do it, they have the power to do otherwise. Effectively, what the conclusion is saying is that even when it comes to waffle eating, I never had the power to do other than what I actually did. Nor, more generally, does anyone ever have the power to do anything other than what they actually do. And if I don't meet the ability to do otherwise condition, then I'm not free. And more generally, no one is free in anything they do. So all of my actions are untouchable facts or not free. We could have run this argument with any of my other actions, or we could have run it with yours. None of your actions are free. So the conclusion is that there's no freedom, and that conclusion is conditioned on determinism's truth. Because the defense of the second premise assumed determinism. If you don't assume determinism, then the second premise is not plausible. What Van Inwagen has shown, if this argument works, is that not just this abstract claim that, like, my actions are all untouchable, but why that matters is that if they're all untouchable, then I never satisfy the AO condition, nor do you, and I'm never free because I don't satisfy the AO condition. And furthermore, this is an argument for incompatibilism because it was all conditioned on the assumption of determinism's truth. In other words, what he's shown is that if determinism's true, then no one is ever free. But that's just incompatibilism, or FW3. And in class, we went on from here to talk about some different versions of incompatibilism. We spent a day discussing Robert Kane's libertarian incompatibilism. I'm not going to make a video on that. You know, I want to make sure to reward people who came to class and were here for that discussion. You should know it though. So if you missed that portion, try to talk to somebody and get notes, or or you know, do those readings again, because a lot of that material is in the Kane reading, and in the Van den Wagen reading. All right. Thank you very much.